Perhaps you're looking for certain health benefits like improved energy, improved mitochondrial function, increased immune system function, reduction in inflammation, or just faster healing and recovery from daily life. Most of us end up turning to either pharmaceuticals or hopefully, in many cases, nutrition or nutritional supplements to try to gain access to a lot of these benefits. Well, there's an entire category of therapeutic compounds that are often completely overlooked, and that's in gases. Gases like oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen and carbon dioxide and nitric oxide. And maybe they're overlooked because they're too obvious, or maybe they're overlooked because it's not actually a pill you can swallow. In any case, these benefits can be gained by exposure to these gases, and that's what this series is about. We started this series with an introduction to the different gases that we're going to be covering, and this is now video 2, and in this video we're going to be covering the effect and the benefits, but also the risks and the delivery of oxygen and nitrogen. Why might you want to be exposed to them? What benefits might you get from the exposure? And what's the best way to deliver these essential gases for therapeutic benefit? Now again, maybe these gases are overlooked because of how obvious it is. Right now you're breathing air. In that air mixture is predominantly nitrogen. About 79% of the air that we're breathing right now is nitrogen. And about 21% of that air that we're breathing is oxygen. And so, every day, day in, day out, 12 to 16 times a minute, you're breathing air. And so you're bringing oxygen and nitrogen into your system. And so we're already getting, to some extent, the amount of oxygen that any human is capable of getting. If you were to measure the oxygen load in your blood right now, assuming that you're close to sea level, and we put a pulse oximeter on your finger, as long as your heart is healthy and your lungs are healthy, you would be getting about 100% saturation of oxygen in your red blood cells, meaning that under normal circumstances, there's really no way to increase the amount of oxygen you're carrying. Nitrogen at 1 atmosphere, or nitrogen that we're getting at surface atmospheric pressure, is again about 79% of the air that you're breathing, and it's considered inert. In other words, it's in your system, you're at saturation or equilibrium with nitrogen in your environment, and nitrogen doesn't have any obvious effects on our bodies at surface pressures. And as a result, it's generally not looked at as a gas that has a biological effect, let alone any biological or therapeutic benefits. And so here we are right now, we're at surface pressure or 1 atmosphere. We're breathing air, which again is 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen. And we're getting, like I said, about as much oxygen as we could possibly carry. And so that brings in our first modality that we're going to talk about, which is hyperbaric oxygen. And we've covered so many different topics on hyperbaric oxygen on this channel. But just to recap the basics, which is oxygen is a passive diffuser inside your body. Right now, the atmosphere you're surrounded by has a pressure. That pressure is what's driving oxygen from the air into your lungs, and then ultimately from your lungs into circulation. Under normal atmospheric pressure, you're already saturating red blood cells 100%. And so we can't add any higher amounts of oxygen into our system because we can only carry in our red blood cells 100% saturation. That is until we change atmospheric pressure. And when you go into a hyperbaric chamber, that's what's happening. The hyperbaric chamber is creating a temporary increase in atmospheric pressure that's surrounding the person inside the chamber. And as a result, we're creating increased pressure of the gas. And so while at surface pressure, I'm fully saturated with oxygen, as I increase atmospheric pressure inside the chamber, I'm driving more oxygen into circulation. Now, again, I said you could only be 100% saturated in your red blood cells. So where does that extra oxygen go? It literally gets dissolved into the plasma of your blood and then ultimately into your other fluids, your interstitial fluid, your lymphatic fluid, your cerebral spinal fluid. And so all these other fluids inside your body ultimately are the carriers of oxygen under hyperbaric exposures. Now, in most cases with hyperbaric, you're breathing enriched oxygen, meaning you may not be breathing 21% oxygen, you might be breathing 90 or 95% or even 100% oxygen inside the chamber. Once you change the pressure of the environment, the percentage of oxygen that somebody's breathing becomes an exponential factor. And so you have this increased pressure. Even if you were breathing air, you're going to drive more oxygen into circulation. And then as you increase the percentage of oxygen, you're exponentially increasing the amount of oxygen being driven into that person's body. As a result, the load of oxygen that we can get into circulation is enormous. Depending on the pressure we're using and the percentage of oxygen that somebody's breathing, this could be 3 times, 8 times, 12 times, 20 times the amount of oxygen that we could normally carry. Now, more is not better. And if you've seen any of my other videos, it's not like we should figure out, well, what's the most a human can tolerate. We really want to try to learn how to match the level of oxygen that somebody's experiencing or the dosage of oxygen that we're exposing a person inside the chamber to. And we want to match that with whatever their health goals happen to be. And so, more severe and more acute cases, they might require higher pressures inside the chamber and higher percentages of oxygen inside the chamber. Something that's a little bit more, let's say, wellness related or longevity related, well, maybe they could use lower pressures and lower percentages of oxygen. So our goal should be to match the intensity of our therapy with the health goals that the person's trying to achieve. Now, what role does oxygen play in our body? Well, strictly, even at atmospheric pressure, oxygen is literally the fuel or part of the fuel system for creating energy. We can bring in a variety of different fuels into our body through food, but ultimately we need to oxidize that fuel in order to extract energy from it. So even at surface pressures, we're using oxygen to metabolize our fuel sources. Our bodies can run on a variety of different fuels. I'm just going to use glucose to simplify the conversation. So glucose or sugar is one fuel source that our cells can run on. The chemical formula for that is C6H12O6. That's a molecule of glucose. So it's a mixture of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We then take that fuel, that carbon and hydrogen backbone, and we oxidize it with a certain number of oxygen molecules. And then there's a chemical reaction. And in that chemical reaction, we can produce ATP, cellular energy, and we could produce some power from that and heat. And then there's going to be byproducts of that same chemical reaction, which is carbon dioxide and water. And so in chemistry or in biochemistry, that's the basic breakdown of oxidizing our fuel to create power. And then there's these waste products left over. Carbon dioxide is another gas that we're going to be talking about in a future video. So what happens in the hyperbaric chamber? Well, in the hyperbaric chamber, we're delivering exponentially higher levels of oxygen. And so what does that mean from an energy production standpoint? Well, what that means is we can drive more oxygen into circulation, which means the cells can bring more oxygen into the cell, ultimately driving that into the mitochondria, which is where energy production exists. And so as we increase oxygen delivery to the mitochondria, we're increasing mitochondrial efficiency and therefore ATP production, increasing cellular energy systemically throughout the whole body. So that's a conversation around how does the increased atmospheric pressure and the increased oxygen drive improved energy production. But oxygen is also a cell signaling molecule. In other words, oxygen also works to stimulate immune system activation, reduce inflammation, upregulate growth factors and stem cells for repair and regeneration of tissue. It signals hormonal balance and neurotransmitter balance. And as a cell signaler, we can create increases and decreases in our oxygen levels two different ways. One is when you go into the chamber, that's the loading phase. We're increasing systemic oxygen carrying capacity. And then when you get out of the chamber and there's no longer this amount of pressure holding that oxygen in solution, that oxygen begins to escape. Just like when you open a can of seltzer, that gas that's inside that liquid begins to escape. The same thing happens to our body. And as that oxygen is escaping, it becomes a signaling agent to stimulate repair, regeneration, healing, and reduction in inflammation, as well as improved immune system function. The other way we can stimulate that is by taking what's called air breaks. And so you could be in the chamber at a certain pressure, breathing oxygen, and then periodically during that session, remove the oxygen level, which creates this increase and decrease in oxygen during your session. Either way, as a result of these oxygen fluctuations, we're magnifying oxygen's cell signaling power. And that's where so many of the additional benefits of hyperbaric come in outside of strictly oxygen as a fuel. We've done a variety of videos on both of those topics. So if this is new to you, please check out some of those older videos on what oxygen's effect on the mitochondria happens to be, as well as all the other powerful cell signaling advantages of using oxygen in the hyperbaric environment. And lastly, part of oxygen's cell signaling cascade includes the fact that as we increase oxygen inside the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is increasing ATP production, there are some free radicals that are released in that process. And as ATP production increases, that free radical exposure also increases. I know that free radicals and oxidative stress is a really bad name out there and ultimately is being blamed for the majority of chronic illness that people are suffering from. But some of this free radical exposure is actually very therapeutically valuable. It's all about keeping our oxidative stressors in balance. And a major part of the benefits of hyperbaric come from this free radical stimulation and how that free radical stimulation ultimately creates a more robust antioxidant system inside of our bodies. Again, we've done quite a few videos on that topic as well, so please check those out if this is new to you. We'll get right back to the video in a minute. I just wanted to quickly share that the Hyperbaric textbook that Dr. Joe DeTore and I have been working on for the last 18 months is finally available and ready for order. As most of you know, I've been teaching and certifying people in hyperbaric medicine for the last few years, and I have felt like what was missing was a concise book to describe everything that we cover in our courses. Is it a substitute for the course? Absolutely not. Is it a great addition to the course? Definitely is. And if you can't get to one of our courses yet, is it a great place to really jumpstart your hyperbaric education? Yes, absolutely. So just click the link in the description below and grab your copy today. If you're not adding oxygen to the hyperbaric chamber, then you're breathing air, and air-only hyperbarics is proving to also have a very high therapeutic value. In an air-only environment, you're breathing, again, 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen. And so while you're increasing the oxygen level, you are really increasing the nitrogen level because that makes up such a high percentage of the air that we breathe. Many years ago, as research was being conducted in hyperbaric, we used to use a mild pressure air-only environment as a sham in the research, meaning it's a fake treatment that has no therapeutic value. However, after years and years as using it as a sham as part of a control inside of a research project and seeing that it clearly has a therapeutic value, the design of these research projects has needed to change. So as we're in this hyperbaric environment, breathing air only, and nitrogen's making up almost 80% of the gases that we're breathing, we're getting a very high load of nitrogen in that hyperbaric air only environment. The research in air-only hyperbarics is literally still in its infancy. And as a result, we don't know exactly what these benefits are. However, there's been a landmark study in hyperbarics at 2 atmospheres on 100% oxygen showing that it increases stem cell production up to 8-fold. So a really high increase in stem cell production at higher pressures and on 100% oxygen. There's been a more recent study done about 2 years ago out of the University of Wisconsin that was looking at mild pressures, so 1.3 atmospheres, and air only, no additional oxygen. And other than the change in the gases and the pressure, the rest of the methodology of that research project was left identical to the 2.0 on 100% oxygen. And what they found was somewhere between a 2.5 to 3 times increase in stem cell mobilization. And one of the hypotheses of that researcher is perhaps the increase in nitrogen also leads to reactive species, but in this case, maybe an increase in reactive nitrogen species rather than only an increase in reactive oxygen species. And again, as I said earlier in the oxygen section, these reactive species of oxygen and nitrogen have a way of stimulating growth, repair, regeneration of tissues, as well as balancing of the hormonal and neurotransmitter systems. And so perhaps a method of increasing nitrogen leads to an increase in this RNS, reactive nitrogen species, and has a tremendous therapeutic value. There's a lot more research that needs to be drawn from this to understand it, but we know that air-only hyperbarics has an absolute and definitive place in hyperbaric therapies. As far as potential risks and consequences are concerned, there are a few things to note. One is about the hyperbaric environment in general. So in a pressurized environment, a patient or a person with a pneumothorax or trapped airways or inability to equalize their ears would be complete and absolute contraindications. And there's a number of relative contraindications to the hyperbaric environment as well, again, which we've covered in quite a few videos in the past. In terms of hyperbarics and a high oxygen environment, there are some additional risks like oxygen toxicity, pulmonary oxygen toxicity, central nervous system oxygen toxicity. And those are things to be very aware of and to make sure that you're keeping yourself and or your patients very safe in this hyperbaric oxygen-enriched environment. And again, we've done quite a few videos on that topic. On the nitrogen side, there's really no additional risks of actual nitrogen dose that have really been recorded as far as the hyperbaric environment goes. But really what's to note is similar in a chamber as with scuba diving, which is nitrogen load and then how quickly we decompress from a nitrogen load, and then becoming very familiar with scuba dive related dive tables, which have created guidelines for making sure that we're keeping the diver either in the water or the diver in our chamber safe. And that includes how much nitrogen can a person tolerate, and then how quickly can we start to decompress the chamber, making sure that we're decompressing the chamber safely, and not releasing nitrogen into circulation at a rate or a pace that could be potentially unsafe. Also, just like in scuba diving, if you're doing air-only hyperbarics, especially at considerable pressures, there's a concern between when that chamber session is done or when that dive was done and when that person may fly. And because scuba diving is literally air mixtures for the most part, 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen, we would want to follow all the same rules in air-only hyperbarics as we would with any scuba diver at similar depths and over similar periods of time. So that's the hyperbaric conversation and where oxygen and nitrogen fit there. But there are other oxygen delivery systems like EWOT and Ozone. And so for a deeper dive on both of those modalities individually, go back and check those videos out. However, as a summary, oxygen is obviously a very powerful and therapeutic molecule. And hyperbaric is one way to deliver O2, or what's called molecular oxygen. It's two oxygen molecules bound together. And that's how oxygen is typically found, let's say, in atmospheric air. EWOT is another way to get additional O2, or molecular oxygen. And EWOT is a system of exercise, varied intensity of exercise with varied and fluctuating oxygen percentages. And this is also a fabulous tool for improving oxygenation. And specifically, it's a great way to exercise red blood cells and get improved red blood cell carrying capacity, improved red blood cell delivery, and teach the body how to adapt to a changing level of exercise intensity, as well as a changing level of oxygen concentration. So it's an amazing tool, especially for training and for athletes. And it's another way of delivering molecular oxygen to a person at higher levels of oxygen than what you and I can get at rest and at atmospheric pressure. Ozone, on the other hand, is not molecular oxygen anymore. Ozone is not O2, ozone is actually O3. And so now we have three oxygen molecules bound together, and that molecule is not stable for long periods of time. So unlike O2, which is the way we find oxygen in the atmosphere and is a very stable molecule, O3 is three oxygen molecules bound together, and as a result is a much more unstable molecule. It's a reactive molecule. It's a reactive oxygen species molecule, which means that this extra oxygen molecule is very likely going to leave its compound to go react with another more stable molecule. It's going to literally oxidize another molecule, which is where oxidative stress comes from. While that may sound dangerous to some of you, oxidative stress is a requirement for normal and healthy biological function. Strategically, we can use oxidative stress to have very specific effects inside of our body. So what might we use ozone for? Well, there's two pathways that ozone might help us with. One is, once that O3 molecule breaks apart, on one hand, you're left with some O2. And that increase of O2 can have a similar, typically not as extensive, but a similar effect as the increase in oxygen from, let's say, EWOT or hyperbaric, especially as far as increasing O2 levels could drive some increased mitochondrial function. And on the other hand, we have this singular oxygen molecule that is now reactive. Well, let me explain this. Inside your body, your white blood cells use reactive oxygen species to help fight infection. It's literally some of the ammunition that our body already has inside of us to help destroy invaders, especially viruses. So now we can use ozone and this reactive molecule as immune support. In other words, as we increase the reactive oxygen species inside circulation, that becomes additional ammunition to actually help your immune system fight any invaders. So we can certainly use ozone for improved immune function, as well as actually helping to attack and kill foreign invaders. And so ozone is a great therapy for improved immune function. An additional conversation that may stem from understanding now different ways of delivering oxygen, people would ask, well, can we combine hyperbarics and ozone? The short answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no, in that hyperbaric is delivering predominantly O2, which is going to have a higher level of mitochondrial stimulation, energy production, as well as all that tissue repair and regeneration and inflammation control that we talked about earlier. But at the same time, there is some increase in reactive oxygen species being released from the mitochondria. And then here with ozone, we have a tool that's literally predominantly oxidative stress. And so depending on how healthy and resilient a person is, doing hyperbaric and ozone simultaneously or within the same day could be too much oxidative stress for that person. Other people may be able to tolerate that well. We have to use our clinical judgment to understand how much hyperbaric we're exposing somebody to, how much ozone we're exposing a person to, and then combine that with our understanding of how resilient the person that we're doing this with is, and make a clinical call whether that's appropriate or not. In many cases, we separate them. We do hyperbaric for a period of time and then ozone for a period of time. If somebody needs more healing and regeneration and or improved energy production, we tend to lean on hyperbarics more. If somebody needs more immune support and infection control, we tend to lean on ozone more in those cases. So I know this was a lot of information. I appreciate your attention. Our goal here is to start to understand gases as therapeutic compounds that we could be using to help improve our health and vitality. Today, we discussed oxygen and nitrogen, as well as 3 modalities, hyperbaric, EWOT, and ozone, as ways of delivering these different gases. In our next video, we're going to cover another gas, hydrogen, and the role that hydrogen plays in physiology, in biology, and how to expose ourselves to hydrogen safely in a way to gain those therapeutic benefits. And then beyond that, we'll be covering a few other gas compounds and what their therapeutic value is. So please make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss any of those future videos.